Hey, this is Akshay Dhawre and welcome back to another video from Photographic. Today we're going to talk about the Leica look. Let's see what we got. Alright, so this story starts about 10-12 years ago. I think it was 2008 or even 7, I think, when I got my first DSLR camera. I had used some prosumer cameras till then, and I had obviously shot a lot of film, but this was my first foray into the digital photography world, and it was through the Canon 450D. It was an entry-level DSLR, and I enjoyed it quite a bit for the first 3-ish years. And then I realized that I was getting really good at it and I wanted to upgrade. I upgraded to the 5D Mark II. Now, that was a huge investment at that point, but it was also one of the most revolutionary cameras that Canon had brought out. It was the beginning of the era of using DSLRs for cinematography, and so 5D Mark II was one of the first cameras that really did video well, and it brought in a whole new medium of expression for photographers. Now, I did not get close to video at that point. Even right now, I'm just beginning to understand video. I mainly work with photographs, with still images. That's how I express my creativity. But nonetheless, the 5D Mark II served me really well for about 8-ish years. I'm very proud of some of the work that I've done during that phase. But around 2018, I was looking to upgrade, and I was looking for other full frame systems to upgrade to, and my natural choice should have been Canon, but Canon just wasn't offering anything meaningful in the price range that I was looking for at that point. The 5D Mark IV was extremely expensive. The 6D wasn't really that great, and so it wasn't a compelling upgrade from a 5D Mark II. And I started looking at other systems, and that's how I got my first Sony. And for what it does, I think the Sony a7 III is just amazing. It does video well, it does photographs really well. 24 megapixel is the sweet spot in terms of how many pixels you pack into a full frame sensor, and what do you have to deal with afterwards while editing the files, for example. And so I've loved the Sony. But one of the criticisms that Sony gets quite a lot, and especially the a7 III, is that its color science is a bit off. And really, actually, the files themselves, you need to work with those files. They are not ready to just share as you get them out of the camera. And we'll see a couple of examples of this. Especially in the beginning when I bought the Sony and I went out and did a bunch of landscapes, and I brought it home, and what I found was just unbelievably flat files compared to what I had seen out of my Canon for 8-ish years. And it took me some time to realize that the fact that it was flat was good because I could really recover a lot of details both from the highlights and from the shadows. And so the dynamic range on the Sony files was definitely much better than what I had experienced on the Canon 5D Mark II. And I'm talking about all of these things in context of Lightroom. So there's a lot that the software also does to interpret the raw images from different companies, and they keep making it better, and that's why you get so many updates for Lightroom every now and then, because they keep making it better. So if you look at the process version in Lightroom, they're at process version 5 right now. It started off with 1, which was I think about 10ish years ago. And so the way that the software interprets these files has also improved over time. But I remember feeling really scared when I first opened those files in Lightroom, because they were just extremely flat. But apart from being flat and hence having a lot of latitude to work with, they also were off in terms of colors, and you especially see this in terms of portraits. And lots of people have talked about this, so I don't want to get into the details of what is the problem with Sony. But one of the things that compelled me to buy the Leica Q2 or any Leica really was the Leica look, the colors behind it, and that film style look that you get from Leica, or you're supposed to get from Leica. And that was a big part of the decision that I made. One of the reasons why I did not go for the monochrome version was that I actually wanted to see the colors. And I think that is part of what you pay for when you buy a Leica. And so today I want to take you through the journey that I've had over the last 2-ish months, trying to really understand color theory, trying to understand what constitutes a look, and we'll see if the Leica has lived up to its expectations. So let's get started. So what is a look? I think a look is constituted of 3 or 4 different parameters. The first one, of course, is contrast. And so you have the latitude that I was talking about earlier. You have the difference between the brightest of the brights and the darkest of the darks. So the difference between white and black, and how many tones do you get between the white and black. It's also called as dynamic range. If you get really bright whites and deep darks, then it's a high contrast image, which means that the dynamic range has been reduced, and that makes for punchy photographs. Whereas if you get a lot of tonality in between, it makes for a flat image to begin with, but you have more room to play with, and so you can work with that file and you can bring it up to the contrast that you like, and that's an advantage when you're looking to process the files. But if you're looking to not edit files, you don't want to spend time in front of the computer, you want to spend time taking photographs and then sharing photographs, then I think the contrast that the camera can give you is an important factor. And a lot of that has to do with the profiles and the firmware and the way the camera interprets what it sees on the sensor. So that's the first thing, that's the contrast and the dynamic range. There's also another important aspect which is called micro contrast. And micro contrast is a more difficult term to define. There are a few videos that I've seen which attempt to define this, and I'm going to link them in the description. But it comes down to sharpness, right? It's the contrast between details of the image, between detailed tonal changes, and you don't want aberrations at that point, which will reduce that micro contrast. If you get off colors that the camera is not able to interpret, this especially happens when you have a lot of magenta kind of hues. It will interpret certain pixels in a completely wrong color, and that happens because of the interpolation that's happening inside the camera. So it's the firmware, and that ends up creating a shade of magenta that's actually not real. It has some additional other colors into it, and you can't see this if you just look at the image. You have to pixel peep to understand that there's a problem with micro contrast, but it will affect the look of the entire file, and that creates a problem. So that's something to think about. The other thing is aberrations, of course. For example, flares or chromatic aberration, distortion, all of these are basically the lens characteristics showing up in the photograph. And sometimes you can use it creatively, but sometimes these are really aberrations. They're an incorrect way of representing reality. But you deal with it because you've put a piece of glass between the reality and the sensor, and so Some of this is just the result of the quality of that glass. So aberrations are something to look out for when you're trying to think about the look of the image. And like I said, these aberrations, they can affect the look at a macro scale in terms of flare, for example, but they can affect the look also in terms of the micro contrast especially. And so that's something to look out for. The fourth element I feel is quality of the bokeh, and basically for lack of a better word, the creaminess of how things phase out into out of focus areas. So you have some parts of the image that are absolutely tack sharp in focus, and then behind that object or in front of that object, depending on the depth of field, you're going to get gradual reduction in focus, and the graduation of that reduction in focus actually contributes to the look quite a bit. And so if you don't have creamy bokeh, if you have very harsh bokeh, it can be extremely distracting when you're trying to look at the photograph. So that's, I think, another important element of what is a look. And lastly, of course, are the actual colors. Is red interpreted as red on your camera? What is red anyways, right? It's a bit of a philosophical question, but color science is important. The way your camera interprets each of the primary colors is important, and because of their interpretation of the primary colors, the interpretation of all the other shades where those colors exist will also change. And so color science is just an extremely important aspect of creating a look. Now, what is the Leica look? I'm going to try to define the Leica look the way I understand it, the way I've enjoyed Leica images. And mind you, a lot of these are black and white images, because Leica has been used for black and white photography much more than for color photography. And so the color aspect, this last point that we talked about, is less defined. It doesn't come out as much as the black and white aspects has been studied and interpreted in a better way. So anyways, what is the Leica look? I think the Leica look is high contrast, macro contrast, decent dynamic range, but it really creates a punch in the image. And so that punch is important if you're trying to create a Leica look, or if a camera is trying to create a Leica look. The micro contrast is extremely important. The quality of the lens, the resolution of the lenses that Leica produces, especially the M lenses, and the ability of the sensor to actually pick up and reproduce that resolution in the final image is extremely important. And this is one of the things that I've just found the Leica Q2 to be unbelievably awesome at. I did not realize that I would get this level of a jump in terms of image quality compared to the Sony that I was using. These sensors are not very far apart, by the way. I think the Sony sensor may be a year earlier than the Leica. I think the Sony got released in 2018 and the Leica got released in middle of 2019. So it's not that these sensors are very far apart, and there has been a lot of development between when these sensors started getting manufactured. But the difference in image quality is just astounding. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lens as well. The 28 Sumilux on the Leica Q2 is just phenomenal. The quality of the bokeh, oh my god. I mean, you can taste the creaminess of the bokeh in each of these images, and especially there's a macro mode in the Leica Q2, and every time I use it, I'm blown away by the results. How sharp the actual subject is and how beautifully it fades away into nothingness in the background is just amazing. And I think when it comes down to color, which is our fifth parameter, There are a few characteristics that are very special to Leica. The first one is muted blacks but deep blacks. Um, and this is, again, it's a little difficult to explain just by words, and we're going to look at a few images soon. Um, the primary colors are fairly saturated, and that results in good color contrast overall. And so while you have this mutedness in the shadows, for example, that doesn't turn all the colors into like pastel kind of shades. You have strong color contrast and strong saturation in the primaries, and that's why in all of those colors. And the ability for a camera to interpret really deeply saturated primary colors is one of the first tests that you should do if you're trying to check what your camera is capable of doing. We'll look at some images back from the shoot that we did with Vidhi, where she was wearing a bright red dress, and I'll show you what I mean when we look into those images. And then the highlights are soft and glowy, and this has to do with the bokeh as well, but it also has to do with the contrast and so the overall look. Like the highlights are bright, but they are soft and they glow and they merge into the rest of the image in a very beautiful way. And I think that's an important aspect of the Leica look as well. So enough of me talking. Let's look at some images, and we'll see if the Leica lives up to its reputation. Alright, see you in a bit. Alright folks, here we are. So this is Lightroom. I have a bunch of images here, and these are the images that I got straight out of the camera. This is the Sony RAW file. This was a setup. There's a bit of a French press, my coffee grinder, some coffee beans, and a coffee mug. And there's my curtain and wall in the background. And the color of this coffee mug is quite specific, and that's what I was trying to recreate. And I wanted to make sure that that color is reproduced properly in these images. So this is what I got from Sony. The white balance is auto, and I have not made any adjustments except for pulling the exposure down a little bit by half a stop, because I made some error with the settings, and so it got overexposed compared to the other cameras. So anyway, that's the Sony, and this is roughly 50 mm. Yeah, these shots are all around 50 mm. That's the Leica. So that's what I got straight out of camera from the Leica. And again, this is at 50 mm. So with the Leica, what I did was I cropped in. So I cropped the 50 mm frame length and composed using that. Now you see an obvious difference between the Sony and the Leica in terms of the depth of field. And that's always going to be there, because essentially I'm using this Leica like an APS-C camera, or even like a micro four thirds camera, because I'm cropping in to 50 mm on a 28 mm lens. Anyways, we can get into that in another video, but that's what I got out of the Leica. Today we are only going to look at the colors, and then this is what I got from Canon. The 5D Mark II, I hadn't used it in a while, but it's still producing very good images. So I'm quite pleasantly surprised by what I got from the Canon. So once again, let's quickly take a look at all of them. This is the Canon, the Leica. I think both of them are very close together. And then the Sony is a bit warmer. And I feel like this is more accurate interpretation of what the light looked like. But I also used a color corrector to actually make sure that all of these three cameras um, are reproducing the right colors. So if you see this, the profile applied here is Adobe Color, which is the default profile that you'll get in Lightroom, and that's what it is for all the images. But then these are the color corrected images, right? And so this is Canon, sorry, this is Sony. This is Sony, by the way. So if you check its ARW, I made a error with the name of the profile, but this is Sony. um, this is Leica, and this is Canon. Yeah. And so um, now if you see, they are all very similar. There's hardly any difference between how these cameras are now treating these colors. And again, these are, you know, pastel types of colors. They are a little muted. When you see bright saturated colors, that's when the difference is even more obvious. But what this does is basically it is bringing all the cameras to a level playing field in terms of the starting point for the images. And after that, I have applied what I use as my Leica preset. This is something that I've developed over some time, um, and that's what we're going to look at for all of these pictures. So this is Canon. So a Canon image, color corrected, and then uh, applied a Leica preset on it. Uh, this is Leica originally, and this is the Sony. And to be fair, I actually really like the Sony and the Leica files here. So that is the Leica look that I was talking about. And basically the point that I wanted to make was that this is not a look that you get from Leica. What you get from Leica is this. And so this whole thing about the Leica look is really, it comes down to you being able to edit your pictures to look in a certain way. And so there's some effort that you need to put into creating the Leica look. Now let's also take a look at the portrait photographs that we took in one of the other videos, and I'll show you how much difference the color corrector makes. This is Vidhi wearing this very bright red dress, and it's just not reproduced properly in this image. Um, we're going to take two examples. So let me look at this one first. Now, if you see, the profile here is Adobe Color, and this is a standard profile that Lightroom will use when you import a picture. And so this is the Leica door profile, which is when I was shooting against the door. And so you can see the difference between the color of the dress. If you look at this interpretation of red versus what we got just out of the camera, right? There's a, it's towards the pink side in this case, whereas here it goes much more towards saturated bright red, and that's really the main difference. There are some other changes as well to the overall look. I think the brown colors are enhanced a little bit. The shadows are enhanced basically a little bit. But that's what you get once you color correct the image. And then the Leica preset that I was talking about, that is what is going to reproduce this in, again, what I have taken to be the Leica look. And so, like I was saying, muted but deep blacks. So the blacks are not black, but there are deep shadows in the picture. So wherever there should be shadows, there are shadows. Wherever there should be highlights, there are highlights, but they are glowy highlights that sort of blend into the midtones very easily. And then the primaries are always saturated. And then there is some lift in the shadows, and so there's difference between her hair and the door, for example, which was very difficult to see in this situation. This is what we got straight out of the camera. Let's look at another example. This was at the sofa. This is the wine glass pic that lots of people liked quite a bit. Um, Again, the if you look at the change to the color of the dress, it's quite significant. The shadows also lift up a little bit. Now this one is not going to be in focus, so we literally just see the change in color. Again, this is towards the pink, and then this one is much warmer. Um, and then this is the final look that we got after starting off with the presets and then of course making some edits on my own here. And so this is the difference, right? And if you're looking for the muted film kind of look, you're going to have to create it. It's not going to be available just out of the camera. So that's what I wanted to leave you with. The Leica look is something that you have to create, and a lot of it is really subjective as well. I don't think there's one thing called the Leica look. I've tried to describe it the way I have seen Leica, but your interpretation might be very different from how I see it. It's also important to understand that the look is essentially a creative tool that the photographer uses, and so you might get a good starting point with a particular camera and you might like that starting point, but just like old masters used to use the darkroom to actually interpret what they had already captured on film, you have to do that post-processing to create the picture that you envisioned in your mind when you took it. So I'll leave you with that. Hopefully this was useful. This was a very long video, but thanks for sticking around, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. And I will see you in another video sometime soon. Bye.